Well, I was talking on the gut rounds, and I have gone all the way to 1967 when there was this anti-dumping measures put um, into the subjects covered. In 1970s, non-tariff measures and frameworks agreements were also in, and then uh, rules, services, intellectual property, dispute arguments, textiles, agriculture, all of these have been subject when uh, 1960 between 1986 and 1994, and as a result, the topics will become uh, much so much more complex, and um, basically the meetings got very long. As a result, a permanent institution called World Trade Organization was founded. World Trade Organization is among the most hated organizations. Actually, the famous demonstrations in Seattle, if you maybe if you, in 1990s you might have heard of it. I mean, it's the time when globalization and the U.S. dominated world was almost told as invincible. But even at the heart of United States, there were these huge demonstrations, which almost turned a war, battle-like an environment in Seattle in 1990s. You can actually there's a movie called Battle for Seattle. You can watch it. Um, it is one of the most hated institutions after IMF and World Bank, maybe. Maybe in some cases even beyond that. It mainly the main reason is actually it is enforcing free trade measurements, but in some cases, free trade might be harming the vast majority of certain people, even if in theory it creates in a static environment. Again, not in a dynamic environment, but at least in a static environment, it might be benefiting the country. But that benefit might be basically going to the top of the country's top economic. I mean, the people belonging to the top 1% or top maybe 10% of the population in terms of economic wealth. And the rest might be harmed, especially if essential commodities become very expensive and the working conditions get worse, uh, and national industries are destroyed, for example, and in some cases also World Trade Organization negotiating the uh, certain rules which might create environmental degradation in countries. So, its stated aims, which you can see, there's a handbook type of document of World Trade Organization in the readings. You can see them there, and it's interesting actually. I will encourage you to read the introduction. It says trade without discrimination, so everyone should have equal type of rules in case of trade. Although that might also, in some cases, certain groups might get certain subsidies and get certain benefits if they are ability to pay and ability to compete is relatively not that high. So we should think this with even this principle with it's called in English grain of salt or with some doubt. Freer trades without as uh, little tariffs as possible, as little quotas as possible. Quotas is maximum number of goods you can import. Predictability, making the conditions within a country more predictable. It might be infrastructure, it might be uh, the the uh, the for example transportation or storages, but it might also be things like fees or economic conditions in the country or the company's ability to pay. Uh, those things should be as predictable as possible. And World Trade Organization might negotiate certain terms to create this predictability. Promoting fair competition, and fair is here a very critical word. Um, Encouraging economic reform and development. So these are the WTO principles, and for which it is it claims it is working. And when you look to the handbook I was talking about, you can see under each of these a lot of explanation. But that explanation, in my opinion, you can read and make your own, have your own opinion, but don't change the vagueness or let's say the potential dispute on the role of WTO and its principles. Even with these 5 simple terms without further explanations might be taken to different directions, and those different directions might be benefiting different I mean, it might disproportionately benefit or even in some cases harm the developing countries, and even certain segments of world population beyond countries, even in the developed part of the world or developing part of the world. So to the exact effects of these principles in the way they are applied is a big question, and especially when only states are involved in the discussion, and how strong each state's position is, and whether states should be the only actors that should be there, or whether some other organizations like businesses, NGOs, community groups should also be in, is a question we should ask in terms of these organizations. So, in a way, how these organizations should be regulated is an important question. Of course, we should also take into account the fact that the developed countries might be the ones that are providing the resources for these institutions to run and exist, and basically create with sufficient level of trade the basis of developed or integrated world economy. So in that sense, those countries with relatively more power and resources, and the ones that use those resources to create integrated economy, which also benefit them, of course, might also want a more control over these organizations. So this dilemma, but of course, then they can use these organizations to maintain and strengthen their control and maintain their position with sole ability to run these organizations. So this dilemma is actually one of the basic dilemma of the globalization process and integration process. These institutions and the global regulations, can they be is a way to set them to benefit the whole world population, or are they inevitably be influenced by the strongest countries in the world? And even if that influence exists, is this influence at agreeable level, or is this influence just at a level that might bring kind of even as some developing countries argue, a neo-colonial type of intervention to the economies of the developing world. So, what are the alternatives of the cooperations? Actually, the cooperation might not necessarily only happen by the global level institutions and regulations. There can also be regional economic cooperation. The most famous one was EU, which was founded actually almost right after the World War II in a different form, and at a much more restricted level with less number of countries. I'm sorry. and then it has enlarged. The closest one, even NAFTA, was found in 1990s, and many others have founded since then, like Mercosur for the Latin American countries and ASEAN for the Southeast Asian countries. And meanwhile, EU has actually uh, strengthened and intensified its economic conditions to the point that not only economic but politically, in many ways, the common rules are actually set, common institutions are set that are running the European economies. But even there, and even though the diversion, the inequality between the European economies are relatively small, arguably, those inequalities play an important part in even in these regional economic corporations. They might create strains. Basically, we will see it in a minute. Well, in some cases, certain NGOs might be spread to the world and creates kind of cooperation, usually in the form of providing some aid and support to the developing countries by the people in developed countries, although it might very well be uh, also to some extent providing support by uh, the relatively high income groups in all countries to low income groups in other countries. And one of the famous one is microcredit, which provides small degrees of credit to the relatively low income people to fund their own businesses. Although this policy itself is very much discussed, and this was actually the topic of one of our discussions, so I'm not going much into this case. Although it is certainly, I mean, that's why I put as a discussion. Certainly, it requires its own discussion, and it has its own discussion in this course. And then you can have international development programs which are formed by the strong countries. United States famously has developed this kind of programs in for many countries. The most famous one is the one developed to the Europe Marshall Plan after World War II. One of the recent programs is actually developed by China, which is called One Belt One Road project, which has actually developed several infrastructural projects mainly in different, mostly low-income countries. And China mostly provides the sources, funds, and assistance for these projects without, I mean, requiring some reforms in political system or economic reforms or certain economic stability, uh, which is one aspect. These programs are, I mean, have become popular, or at least many countries become very much willing to accept these programs, basically because they don't require that much from them. On the other hand, of course, when the countries don't pay for these programs, major facilities, for example, ports, might be taken over by China. But for those countries, even that might be a risk worthwhile because even in Chinese control, that port might play a role in their development. But of course, it is discussed whether, I mean, this program itself might be a way for China to build a new, let's say, uh, new new structure in which a new global economic framework, at least at first a regional economic framework, in which many countries become dependent to China, kind of a neo or 21st century's colonial expansion plan you might think of, or I mean you might simply say we might leave colonial term and we might basically say a new type of dependency might be created by China. I will talk a little bit more on the One Road initiative, and then I will start looking to the European Union, which will be our last topic for this lecture.